All right, hello everyone. I am super excited to talk fruit trees today and fruit in general in Minnesota with Madeline Wimmer. And Madeline, could you give everyone a little intro on what you do and how everything's going?
Hi, yeah, thanks for having me on today. My name is Madeline Wimmer, and I am an extension educator working with fruit crops for the University of Minnesota. My job is regional, but there's only one of me, so I do cover the whole state. And yeah, I cover basically everything about fruit crops. My main goals here at the university are to work with new fruit growers as well as to help established fruit growers incorporate more sustainable practices into their production.
Awesome. That is wonderful. Yeah, we get a lot of questions about fruit at Minnesota Gardening, and I am not the person to be answering them. I am a very novice fruit grower myself. We had our first peach crop this year, which I am super
Nice.
excited that we had contender peach this year, and then also have apple and cherries. And so our cherries have been going for a while, but a lot of people are scared to grow fruit trees, and not just fruit trees. I keep saying trees, which is not the way I should be doing it. So scared to grow their own fruit in Minnesota because it seems to be like they could be temperamental and not hardy here and things like that. So what do you say to people who are nervous about getting started growing their own fruit in their backyards or front yards here in Minnesota in the upper Midwest?
I would really recommend if you're new to growing fruit crops to kind of have some passion before you jump into things. So there's going to be a wide range of crops, some of which are more hardy or more disease tolerant, some which are native, some which need more processing, some which need a lot more inputs than others. So there's really a wide range of fruit crops that we can grow here. And so kind of recognizing like what are your goals? What is your dream with growing, certain fruit crops, and understanding those goals will help steer you. If it's just, I need something easy to grow, I just want to try it out, that's going to be a lot different than someone who's like, I need blueberries, like just blueberries, right? So if you have these dreams, I think it's just really good to take some time to look into what it takes to grow these and to stick with one crop initially. So it might be kind of, exciting to buy a fruit tree of some sort, some shrubs and some strawberries, but that's learning about multiple crops at one time. This works pretty well for vegetable growing, but there are certain nuances between different fruit crops where we're trying to learn how to prune even just an apple tree and pruning, some sort of stone fruit tree like plum versus pruning grapes or learning how to prune shrubs. They're all a little bit different, and none are impossible. None of it's rocket science, but just to not be overwhelmed, I think it helps to really be passionate, find that one fruit crop you want to start with, know what it takes to really set it up for success, and then start slow and expand from there.
So before we get into details and nuance of things, like what are most exciting things you see from your position at the U of M? Like what are the most exciting and fun things happening in the world of fruit in the upper Midwest right now?
I think so. I work a lot more with commercial growers, so I'll kind of answer it from that standpoint. But I think there's kind of this opportunity for us to celebrate certain fruit crops that have always been kind of, more in the shadows. We have a lot more wine that's being produced in our state now, a lot more cider production, mead. So people are really interested in doing craft brewing and, craft like baking and all of that. So I think we really have this opportunity to shed some light on some of these smaller, less known fruit crops that maybe they're not always the best for fresh eating, but they create a lot of unique flavors and aromas when incorporated into certain goods. And I think that's something that we can be excited about. In general, honeyberries are something that's kind of starting to peak up a little bit more. That's not necessarily a fruit tree, but it's a shrub that is very hardy. And it doesn't necessarily, it's a blue fruit, right? Similar to how blueberries are blue fruit, very, very different tasting fruits. But you have this opportunity to grow a shrub crop that is a blue fruit without necessarily needing this soil acidification requirement that blueberries need. So people might get really excited about blueberries, but it does take usually a lower pH for your soil, for which many soils in our state are very high pH, which can make that challenging. So I think some of these newer fruit crops are really exciting for growers.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that have in the last few years that have come about, like honeyberry. Like I was just visiting a client in northern Minnesota last week who planted a bunch of honeyberry, and so I was really excited to see that happening. And I have, I was at Tractor Supply and a couple springs ago got a goji berry, which I have no idea if that's going to be hardy, but just playing with it to see what happens there. And there just seems like
Yeah.
there's a big expansion happening around these kind of smaller shrub and cane fruit kinds of things. Is that just my experience? Or you think that that's happening more often?
I wouldn't really, I'm not really sure from an industry perspective whether that's the home gardening industry or commercial growing, but I think, for a lot of backyard growers, shrubs can be a really great place to start with fruit growing just because the pruning can be a little bit simpler. Oftentimes, berry crops, I mean, they're a little bit lower to ground, a little easier to harvest. A lot of them are native, which makes them oftentimes more disease tolerant, or maybe and they've evolved with certain pests that already are kept in control by other pests because they're not, invasive pests. And yeah, I think that's definitely something that might be emerging a little bit more. We do actually have, I think it's on our perennial fruit page, we have a little bit of information about goji berries. It's not something that I'm well versed on, but that's really cool to hear about.
Yeah, they're kind of weird little guys. It was we got some last year, and
You did.
yeah, it was just a couple,
Yeah.
and it was one of those things where I fed them to the kids, and we're all like, we're not really sure what I think about this yet, and so we'll see what happens with it. But it grew a lot this year, so we'll see
Okay.
where it grows from there. But then also seeing a lot of folks, and I don't know if this is something you get into, but a lot of the more native berries and those kinds of things with service berries and currants and those kinds of things. Is there any like commercial use or experience you have from the U of M side with those types of things as well?
I think there is the potential for it. I think the biggest thing with service berries is that usually, what you'll hear from growers is that the birds usually get them first. So the birds really know when those are ready. And I'm not sure, like in Canada or other places, what the harvest techniques are for service berries. But a lot of times, what happens is for some of these smaller shrub crops, it's difficult for them to get commercialized because of the labor that it takes to actually pick those berries. And some berries, like aronia berries, are an exception. And even with honeyberries, there's like semi mechanized ways of harvesting them. But they work really well for backyard gardeners because, if you just have a couple of shrubs, it's not going to be that extensive of picking and having to be worried about making income off of that as well. There's a lot of uses for service berries and black currants. Black currants in particular have a lot of heritage from Eastern Europe, and some cultures even use the leaves for tea. So there's, yeah, again, just a lot of opportunity to use those fruit crops.
Right. Awesome. Beautiful. So let's dive into kind of the basics around some different types of fruits that people could grow. And so I know that you work a lot with grapes, so we can start there on things. Like for a home grower, what would be the best way? What do people need to know about the first 1, 2, 3 steps in becoming at least marginally successful in growing grapes?
Yeah, for growing grapes, it's just really helpful to know how you want to train them. There's a lot of, there's kind of that traditional commercial way of growing grapes where some people might view them as like little trees, right? But they're actually vines. So grapes are vines. But year after year, when grapes make shoots, those shoots get hardy, they get thicker over time, and they start to look like trunks. So you can really do anything with grapes. As somebody who's been thinking about grapes for a long time, I've always wanted to like make living furniture, for example. But that being said, with grapes, there's just a few years of establishment that are really required to get that shape. So the first year, you'll have, shoots that you'll be guiding up to make into trunks. That second year, you can grow out the arms, basically, and then by the third year, you're going to be having shoots growing out and getting fruit. With that said, there are ways to train grapes where you can fan train them as well, so that's a little bit simpler pruning, but just understanding what that training takes, I think that's part of the reason why grapes can be kind of intimidating for backyard gardeners. And I'm hoping to kind of produce more materials to guide that and make it a little bit simpler, because it's actually much simpler than what someone might be hearing from me describing. But grapes, compared to a lot of other crops, some people will say they grow like weeds. So as long as they have decent fertility, there's also the wine saying the stressed out grapevine makes good wine, which is like true to a point, right? Because if something's struggling so much that it can't even produce fruit well, then that's an issue. But having a good structure that you want to train it on, whether it's a pergola, fence, or some other trellis that you want to build would be important. And then that training for the first 3 or 4 years is also going to be important for grape production.
So if someone is having grapes just for their families eating, for fresh eating kind of thing, like how many grapes does someone need to have to get any sort of useful amount of grapes? And then secondly, are there any types or varieties that are really good for home owners?
So it's going, depending on how much, whatever you're going to be producing, I guess. If you are a winemaker, you're going to want more vines, but just even a couple of vines. With grapes, you can also kind of control how much fruit is on a vine a lot easier. So you would be getting, a good enough yield to just snack on for like a week or so. Grapes tend to ripen all at once too. So it's one of those things where you may not want so many vines that you can't actually store the fruit. But of course, you can always share fruits. One of my favorite varieties that I've been, holding in my heart, I guess, since I started working with grapes in about like 2012, 2013. Anna is one of my favorites. So that, for those who are less familiar with cold climate wine grape breeding, it actually kind of was a Wisconsin, Minnesota effort. Elmer Swenson was somebody born in Osceola, Wisconsin. He eventually worked with the University of Minnesota. He developed a lot of varieties. Brianna is one of those. And then worked with University of Minnesota to produce some of the more common wine grape varieties that we know today, like Marquette, Frontenac, La Crescent, and all of that. So yeah, so it's got an interesting history to it. MinnesotaHardy.com is a website that I really would recommend people to go to look at Minnesota bred varieties, and that's with all fruit crops. We actually, we're a big breeder of plums for a number of years, like since the 1800s. We have actually bred a couple of peaches. We've bred some pears, and as people know our apple breeding program really well, usually because we were the breeder of the Honeycrisp, which made us pretty reputable.
Exactly. Yeah. And
Yeah.
so I will put links to that in the show notes as well. I pointed down to get the
Great.
show notes for some reason
Yeah.
whatsoever. But so yeah, those who are watching on YouTube will be able to see me pointing for no reason whatsoever. So all right. So that is wonderful black grapes. So next, let's talk about apples, because this is something that comes up a lot of times, and specifically around people are concerned with apples and other fruits that they buy at the grocery store and those kinds of things, with the level of chemicals and what is used, and how, not necessarily how safe they are to eat, but just that use of chemicals on fruit crops on there. So how is it possible for people to grow apples in their backyard without using chemicals, or how does that work for folks, as a long-winded question?
Yeah, and I guess I'll throw it out there too that we thankfully don't spray lead arsenic anymore, which is something that we used to spray like in the early. So we have made it a long way with pesticide applications, and I think there's a lot of information. We could have a whole other podcast about consumer safety, and
Right.
like people get confused with like applicator safety versus consumer safety, but with that being said, there's definitely a lot of reasons why people wouldn't want to spray chemicals, and I think that's fully justified, especially for backyard growers. It can be extremely challenging to grow some types of fruit without any chemical inputs, and apples are one of those fruit types that really can be a challenge to grow completely chemical free without getting any blemishes, right? And so there's going to be, a few different ways to look at it. One way to look at it is you can have standard apple trees that are so big that, you're going to be getting some infection perhaps, but some infestation of like codling moth or apple maggot. But maybe there'll be enough apples that are on that large tree where, okay, like some of them are lost, but there's still some that can be recovered. So there's that. And then a lot of folks would like to grow shorter apple trees with dwarfing rootstocks these days because it takes a lot less time for the tree to get to that point where it's producing apples. Just it's a little bit more precocious. And with that case, there's options when you have a smaller tree to potentially use some netting to keep out insect pests. This is something that we've been researching at the university on a more commercial level. I don't know how available. The netting that we've been using is actually hail netting, so it's not bird netting, which birds are another major issue with fruit crops. So for those who are familiar with bird netting, this is going to be a finer netting that excludes insect pests. And yeah, when it comes to insect pests, that's one option. There are some cultural options to help with apple maggot, for example. It's usually red sticky sphere traps are mostly just used for monitoring in commercial growing. So it's not really like trap and kill as a step. But for backyard home growers, sometimes it's recommended to use, since you might just have one tree, to use sticky traps to try to keep apple maggot away. And so if that's the route that somebody were to go with that particular problem, you could do what's called perimeter trapping. And this is similar, I guess we won't go into a Japanese beetle discussion here today, but like if you were to do perimeter trapping like away from your tree and if you buy kind of a fruit ripening scent lure to go inside of those, then you can draw away apple maggots without bringing them into your tree, because that's one problem of whenever we set up a trap with a lure, you're luring, the pests inside of the tree. Some of them are going to get stuck. Others are going to be like, oh, but cool, I found this apple. I'm actually just going to do my thing that I came
Right.
here to do. So those are a couple of examples. And there are, I'm a little less versed on spray programs for backyard apple growers. I know that there's there's some chemicals that you can't buy because you don't have a pesticide applicator's license or the restricted use or whatnot.
Yeah, no, and that's perfect because my general discussions that I have with other fruit growers is if it's in your backyard, you don't need it to be perfect. Like it doesn't need to
Right.
be, where it's coming from, where it's been, and you're not worried as much about blemishes or other things that are on that fruit and moving from there.
Right.
And so another fruit that's gotten a lot more popularity that I've seen a lot of folks growing lately is peaches. How is the Minnesota world of peach growing evolving and growing from your perspective?
People have, since I've started this position, people have brought up peaches a lot. And there's I feel like I'm not settled on how our history of peach growing has gone in this state. I've heard from some folks that, we used to produce a lot more peaches, but I know for sure we produced a lot of plums at one point. So peaches are not going to be quite as hardy as plums are. When it comes to stone fruits, plums are going to be your hardiest. Peaches, or maybe like tart cherries are underneath plums, and then peaches somewhere in there, and then apricots are going to be the least hardy. But I think peaches, again, some of them, I think for the most part, like Contender is self-pollinating, and it can have enhanced fruit set with an external pollinator. So if you had some other type of peach tree, I think Contender's like the most popular one that I've noticed people growing. But if you did find another variety that was different than Contender that could give some pollen that isn't the same genetics as the Contender pollen, that can enhance fruit set a little bit. But so commercially, we don't grow a lot of peaches. I think backyard growing, it's definitely an option and pretty cool option, especially if you're up in the cities where, you've got a little bit of a boost in USD hardiness there. The flowers are beautiful. If you get a crop, that's awesome. So yeah, I think peaches are a really great crop if you can do that. We have someone in our state, Dan Shield, who actually grows peaches commercially in a high tunnel, which has been a big project for him to work on. And it's pretty cool to see how that has worked. And for him, makes sense, right? Because he can, pick 3 peaches, right? And he gets a pound of fruit. Where, again, commercially speaking, when we go back to some of these other crops where it takes so long to harvest them, it doesn't always economically make sense for growers.
Right. Yeah, we have a grower here in Shakopee. We're in Shakopee, Minnesota, and
Oh, okay.
they are fruit and vegetable grower
Yeah.
just on the outside of town, and this was their first year with a really big peach harvest.
Nice.
And so I
Yeah.
was excited, and they go to farmers markets and they sell that way, and they got CSA and
Cool.
those, so they're doing really well with it. But yeah, this is just our second year with our peach, and it was beyond loaded. I was amazed.
Yeah.
And so we had to remove both with our baby apple tree. We have a baby Honeycrisp apple and the contender, and we had to remove just gallons and gallons of fruit from both of them so that they didn't break the trunk on the poor
Right.
little babies. So that was
Right.
part of our summer maintenance on things. And I think, so we're going to run out of time. I think we could talk for
Sure.
hours and hours about all these things. But can you give general cadence of steps for fruit trees? Like, what are the seasonal requirements for things in general? Like, when does somebody want to prune them? When does somebody want to, like, those kinds of things in overarching umbrella terms?
Yeah, yeah, and I guess before I dive into that, I'll just say that, if we keep having these milder winters, then, stone fruits like peaches are going to be definitely more and more of an option. Be a lot more crops going on then.
It's a big
But,
if, though.
right. So yeah, I mean, you get like one hard winter, right? And then, you may
Right.
not,
Who
you may
knows?
have issues
Yeah.
from that. But yeah, kind of the general steps, I guess I would start with even before planting, figuring out like if you're going the apple route, start thinking a little bit more about rootstocks and order ahead of time. So if you're going to try to put something in for the 2025 growing season, now is a good time to be thinking about that. A lot of times people will start thinking in the spring when things are actually starting to sell out. But now is a good time to be thinking about. Now is a good time to be thinking about your soil. Where are you going to be planting that tree in your yard? Does it get enough sunlight? Does it get enough drainage? Is it at the bottom of a hill where, frost can kind of cool down, cool temperatures can cool down and cause frost damage? So thinking about those things ahead of time is really helpful, and then thinking about like which cultivar, which variety you want to plant. When planting a tree, if it's dormant, you can plant it before the growing season has started. If you're getting a potted plant that is already growing, you'll want to plant that after the last frost has occurred for the springtime. And then from there, training the tree is actually something that people often kind of miss out on. And again, your tree is going to grow year after year. And if you just let it go, it's going to do its thing, but it's going to be hard to back up. You can't really back up with trees. With grapevines, you can chop them to the ground, at least the ones we grow in our area, they'll grow back. With trees, oftentimes you'll hear people be like, oh yeah, this tree didn't get burned for 7 years, and it's like, well, it kind of is where it's at. We can do what we can. But if you can train your tree, which oftentimes, and we'll back up and say also protect it from wildlife, so make sure you've got a good caging, especially if you have a lot of deer and wildlife who can damage that tree itself. But training some of the branches out. So for stone fruits, oftentimes it's recommended to select about 3 to 4 major branches that will become your scaffold branches. If you want to really try to get good quality fruit, you want to bring in a lot of sunlight. With stone fruits, that happens by creating an open canopy. So it's more of an open bowl-centered style of training where you're not necessarily going to have this Christmas tree shape, but you're just encouraging more openness in the center, and that'll bring in a lot more sunlight. Whereas with pears and apples, you're going to do more of like what's called a central leader training. So there's always this one trunk, that one branch that really wants to be the leader, and that's why it can't do that open bowl shape like stone fruit crops can. But training out branches, sometimes people will tie them so that they're a little bit more straight. That's going to help the tree develop more structure, making sure that there's not 2 leaders. So if you have 2 leaders, 2 branches that are trying to lead the tree, that creates an angle where that whole tree can basically just snap, like either from heavy fruit or a storm or something like that. So that understanding training is important. Fruit thinning can be really important. As you mentioned, a huge fruit load can snap a branch. In apples, it can cause biennial bearing, where one year you have a heavy fruit set, the next year you don't. It also, when you have a really heavy fruit set on apples, can cause pre-harvest drop, where all the apples are pushing on each other. If they have shorter stems, they'll pop them off, and so you'll get more drop in those situations. So that fruit control is important. Monitoring for pests, if you are trying to either track them to know what's going on, to know when to put some physical barrier on or to do spraying, that's extremely important. And then at the end of the growing season, I wanted to mention this with apple diseases. There's a lot of encouragement these days to not necessarily remove leaves from the lawn, which is really important, but if you had an apple like this year where you had apple scab and you have a lot of diseased leaves on the ground, mow them, rake them, remove them. You're just taking that inoculum out of the area, so it's less likely to be there the next season to start the disease process again.
Right.
So those are some things. And then pruning. Pruning's the big part that I think a lot of people want to learn about, hoping to offer more programs on that for backyard gardeners. You can prune apples and pears a little earlier, wait on stone fruits, especially if you've had a lot more dips in winter temperatures. But that's kind of like that full season kind of routine, I guess. And there's probably a few things I'm missing, but
probably a few thousand in
a
there,
few thousand
but that was a very, very good overview. So in general, the pruning, when you said a little bit earlier for apples and things versus stone fruits,
yeah.
Like what time of year is that?
Right. So, and when I say earlier, I guess I mean prune your stone fruits later. So typically with apples, you're going to be pruning after the coldest parts of the year, maybe February, early March. If you're a backyard grower and you've only got a few trees, why prune earlier? If you prune earlier and you get more dips in temperature, you're more likely to get, some sort of cold damage that can lead to opportunistic fungal pathogens coming in, causing infections. Stone fruits are a little, they're a little bit more sensitive, so just giving them a little bit more time can be helpful as well. And there's mixed opinions about whether it's okay to prune fruit trees after blossoms have opened or after buds have started to develop. But what I've heard from my colleague Amaya Tucha at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who's been in touch with Cornell and some more of these larger commercial operations, is that they're actually using pruning during bloom sometimes commercially to control fruit. So seems like it's less of a big deal for some trees than others, but do what you're comfortable with, do what seems to align with your goals, always with different practices.
Beautiful. That's perfect. So we're up against the end time here and again, we could talk forever on this, but
right.
Is there anything that somebody needs who is a newbie grower of any fruit? Is there something that we haven't talked about that people really should need to know that we just haven't touched on yet?
There's a lot to familiarize yourself with different tools for pruning or for trellis equipment. I would just really recommend folks stay in touch with the University of Minnesota. We have a really, really great fruit program on our website that walks people through, if you're trying to figure out what can pollinate, your plum tree, what's compatible with that, etc. Our website's really great. We also write weekly fruit updates throughout the growing season to help guide growers, and it's mostly for commercial growers, but it's something that backyard gardeners and more hobby growers could learn a lot from. So if you go to, if you just look up UMM Fruit and Veg News, you can subscribe for that on our website.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great to know. And the website is just a phenomenal resource for everything from the weirdest nuanced little thing up to massive information on things as well. And I used it for understanding and remembering, because we have a cherry tree and do I need multiple cherry trees or just one? And just knowing where those are at as to just good general information on there. The U of M website is wonderful So Madeline from the University of Minnesota Extension, thank you so much for being here. I really, really appreciate it. And if people have questions or more information, where's the best place for them to go?
Well, I do have an email address that's listed online. Email is, you can get a hold of me by email. Sometimes I'm a little bit busy. It can be hard to get back to people that way or by phone call. But yeah, I think that's probably my number one way to contact me is through that way. And you
Perfect.
can find
And
that
just
on
learn through the website.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It's a beautiful thing. Good. All right. Awesome. Well, thank you again for your time. I really, really appreciate it and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Absolutely, Brad. Thanks for having me on, and I hope that this was a little bit of information for folks to dabble into with fruit growing.
Exactly. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.